Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be my July wrap-up. Now for the month of July, I actually have 9 books to talk about today. 7 books I completed, 2 books I'm still in the middle of, but nevertheless, a pretty solid reading month. A lot of the books I read were rather long, so some chunky books were tackled this month. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. I would also say the reading month itself was definitely defined with some hits and some complete misses. The first book, unfortunately, was a bit of a miss for me, and that was the Frugal Wizards Handbook for Surviving Medieval England by Brandon Sanderson. This is Brandon Sanderson's Secret Project number 2, a non-Cosmere novel, but one I was still really excited to pick up and enjoy, especially because it kind of seemed to be a more playful style story by him. And while I would say yes, it's definitely playful, unfortunately for me, it just didn't completely land. In this story, we were introduced to our main character who basically wakes up in a circle of like charred remains. He finds himself in an entirely new place with no memory of who he is or where he came from. Once kind of beginning to do a bit of an investigation, he realizes that the place he's woken up in is very similar to medieval England that we know from our history, but with a few key changes. Around him and like the fiery remains of where he arrived, he also found a few kind of loose pieces of paper, basically letting him know that he bought some type of package to allow him to be an adventurer and magician in some type of parallel universe, and that is where we are. Exploring this world, he stumbles upon a small village and he's kind of thrown headfirst into some politics as he realizes that he is not the only explorer who has arrived from a parallel world. There's actually some very evil bad guys that he feels like he knows from his actual past that he has no memory of, and he begins to set out on an adventure with some other members of this world to try to like save everyone from what is going on from these evildoers who have arrived in this land. This book was honestly just alright for me. I think conceptually it's fun. I like this idea of a parallel universe that's modeled after our medieval England with magic, and I think the use of this handbook that kind of helps our main character along the way was playful and funny for the most part. There's also illustrations throughout the entirety of this book that were super well done, and I actually feel like the strongest element of the story. The part that kind of fell off for me, and I think will kind of be a make or break moment for the story, is I just never really loved the main character. This book was constantly trying to be funny, which is understandable, but the humor personally just wasn't my style and constantly sort of had me rolling my eyes or pulling me out of the book itself. I'll also say that our main character I just never really found so likable. He's basically a cop detective-like character from our world kind of dropped into this new place. And in general, I don't like to read like detective cop contemporary stories, even if they're dropped into a new fantasy place. I prefer, if I'm going to read a detective story, to be like an entirely new world, entirely new set of laws and society. You get the idea there. All in all, I found this book to just be okay. It was compelling and interesting and generally successful in its desire to be a romp, but I just found the main character and the humor and some of the side characters just sort of land flat for me. I was engaged in the story, but I was also looking forward to being finished with the story by the end, if you kind of get my drift. But all in all, I'd probably give this book like a 2.75 stars. From there though, I probably picked up one of my most favorite books of the year so far, the first book to a new fantasy series I'm truly obsessed with, and I also feel like so many people would enjoy. I feel like this is going to like blow up and just be like one of the new It fantasy series, and that is The Will of the Many by James Isington. I actually have a full reading vlog documenting the entire reading process and experience of this book if you're interested in watching that. I'll have that link down below, but this book was so good. It has so many things I love: magical school, chosen one type character, lots of politics and intrigue, an escalating style of plot, lots of emotion. It just truly delivered on so many different fronts. This book is set in kind of a Roman-inspired fantasy setting. Essentially, there's a very powerful empire that has taken over all the neighboring lands, and when they bring people into their kingdom, they also require people to give up their will. Willpower in this world isn't just like a manifestation of like ability or confidence, if you will, but actually a physical force that can be harnessed by different people within the society. The amount of will that you're allowed to tap into is all based on the hierarchy of this world, basically a pyramid system. The more powerful you are, the access to more will you have. The lower on the pyramid you are, you have access to no will, and people can just use you essentially. Our main character Viz is an orphan, and he basically was once the prince to a powerful kingdom that was taken over by this empire. He has been biding his time and living in hiding for most of his life because he is trying to avoid giving over his will to the Empire itself. At the beginning of this book, though, he's basically scouted by a very powerful individual from the military faction of the government, kind of adopted by him because, again, Viz is an orphan, all with the intention of sending Viz to this very prestigious and difficult to get into military school to act as a spy for the military faction of the government. Viz himself obviously has his own desires and trying to keep his identity secret. But things begin to get even more complicated for Viz, our main character, as other factions begin to try to pull him into their own games and plans. He attends the school, he's trying to pass his classes, he's trying to make friends or survive the next day, but also he needs to explore this island where the school is set on, trying to find ancient magic and trying to unpack a mystery that's clearly at play on this piece of land. This book is just so entertaining, so plot forward, and rooted in a main character you're going to like so much. I had a blast reading this book. It was truly captivating from page one. The school setting, the character dynamics, the increasing complexity of the political arrangements that we're seeing Viz have to navigate through was truly top notch. There's training scenes, there's so much dissonance you feel as a reader that you feel through our main character as he's growing close to people he knows are also his mortal enemy and attached to this government that has destroyed everything he has known and loved from his early childhood. I loved The Will of the Many. I can't wait for book 2, which I hope is coming out next year. Amazing, 5 out of 5 stars, such an entrancing first book to new series. I was entertained to no end. Next up, I picked up another book I did not love too much, and that is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. This book was truly everywhere that I just had to see for myself where I would fall on the spectrum of hype. This is actually another book I have an entire reading vlog dedicated to in terms of documenting my experience from beginning to end. So I will also have that link down below if you want to check that out and see a lot more in-depth quips, let's say. But this is a romantasy tale centering dragons in a very difficult and dangerous military school. In it, we follow our main character Violet, who is the daughter of the general of the army. Considered smaller and weaker than her older siblings who did go into the military, Violet really had no anticipation in following their footsteps, but inexplicably at the beginning of the book, her mother says, "No, Violet, you're going into the military and you have to go to this military school to become a dragon rider." Fast forward, we follow Violet as she enters this incredibly dangerous school where basically any day you could die, with the hopes of making it to the end and basically pairing up with a dragon, getting some magical powers, and fighting for your country. What is there not to love? Obviously, upon her arrival, she meets the very mysterious Xaden, who is the son of a rebel forced to attend this military academy, and they have this will they won't they throughout the entirety of the first book. In it, we watch Violet train and also try to survive to make it to the next day. We see her pair up with her dragon and also the development of her relationship with Xaden. Here's the thing with this book, I like romantasy. I love fun and fluffy, not necessarily the most well plotted books that kind of have a fun mixture of magic and romance and will they won't they. For me, when it comes to romantasy books, I don't need to have my mind blown by the plot structure and setup, but I also don't want to be distracted by the plot. If there's too many plot holes or things that don't make sense, it's gonna pull me out of the story and the romance. On the other hand, the most important part of a romantasy book for me is that I like and enjoy the romantic plot element. Initially, I enjoyed the back and forth of the characters of Violet and Xaden, and I thought there was some fun tension there, but very quickly I felt the relationship, much like the plot, just felt very underdeveloped and very accelerated in ways I just personally did not understand. Again, I have an entire video about Fourth Wing, so I'm not gonna go on and on and on, but I did not like the plot. I felt like it was full of so many different plot holes and completely reliant on the fact that you've just read other fantasy books, so you can kind of fill in the blanks as a reader, which I found to be very, very frustrating. I also felt most of the characters, including all the side characters and our main romantic interests, were just not really fleshed out. They didn't feel real to me at any point. But anyway, I can understand why this book is popular. For me, it just personally didn't land, and I ended up giving it a 1.75, 2 stars. I might check out the sequel just to see if maybe some of my issues with the plot are resolved, but that's a very strong to be determined. We will just have to see, but I did read Fourth Wing this month. From there, I wanted to pick up a book I knew I was going to enjoy, so I decided to read Age of Empire by Michael J. Sullivan. This is the 6th and final book to the Legends of the First Empire series, a series I have been reading and talking about ad nauseum on my channel. But hey everyone, I have finally finished the series, and did I enjoy it from beginning to end? I love these books. I found them entrancing and delightful. I loved the characters, I loved the plot dynamics, and I felt the 6th book wrapped everything up beautifully, while also kind of propping up questions that we can kind of continue to explore and tease out in later series I know take place in this world. Obviously, the Legends of the First Empire series is an ancient set fantasy tale. We follow a variety of characters, predominantly humans, as they basically take up a large conflict with another group of people called the Frey, who are kind of elf-like characters. At the beginning of the series, human civilization has not progressed very far, but throughout the course of it, we see the development of society and government and inventions and art and all of this stuff as our characters begin to explore and take on different things. We see them go on quests, sacrifice themselves for their friends and the ones they love most, and everything is always connected to this like larger conflict that's sort of happening between the humans and the Frey. The entire series itself is supposed to feel like the creation of myth, and I feel like Michael J. Sullivan balances the fact that these characters feel really human and flawed to us the entire time, but you also know as you're reading it, it feels like the creation of a story that's going to be used as kind of a basis of understanding much later on, thousands of years in the future. And it's so fascinating to think about these heroic moments of sacrifice sort of being evolved to that myth and legend status. Again, I really enjoyed the sixth and final book. I feel like ending fantasy series is very, very difficult, but I was very pleased with how this series wrapped up. It was emotional, it was heartwarming. I feel like Michael J. Sullivan balances dark and light so well. He crushes my heart, but then makes me laugh on like the next chapter. It's a very confusing time for me emotionally, but I really enjoyed this installment and I would give it like a 4.5 out of 5 stars. The next book I picked up was another anticipated release for the month of July, and that was Immortal Longings by Chloe Gong. I was really curious about this book. This is actually Chloe Gong's adult fantasy debut novel. I've obviously read some of her YA fantasy and personally didn't enjoy those too much. I liked her concepts, but some of the execution elements of it just didn't fully land for me. But I wanted to give her writing another chance with the release of this adult fantasy novel, and honestly, I was really entertained. This was not a perfect book, but I could not put it down. I was intrigued by all of the elements, and I also felt like it was a really fun combination of a lot of different things. It had almost the pacing of a YA fantasy, the darkness and the world building and the magic system of an adult fantasy, and it also had elements of like romance and steaminess that I feel like I don't typically find within, again, an adult fantasy story. And I feel like all of those elements together just made something so fast and entertaining to read, and I had a great time. But Immortal Longings is actually another Shakespearean retelling of Antony and Cleopatra, obviously set in a fantasy landscape. The fantasy world is one that is super urban, and I would almost describe it as like cyberpunk-esque. We're basically set in a city where everyone is living on top of each other. There's some elements of technology, but it's a little more rudimentary and not like super crystal clear, if that makes sense. The city itself is very, very destitute, with the majority of the people living here struggling to survive day to day. The way that the government tries to satiate the populace from basically rebelling against them is they actually put on a series of trials every single year. 88 contestants can vie for the chance to win a huge purse of cash, basically showing that upward mobility is in fact possible if you're willing to kill 87 people to get it. The entire city actually watches these trials from their television sets. In this book, we're following two main characters that both enter these trials for different reasons. First is Kala, who's like a hidden princess with a very, very bloody past. She basically enters these trials to take an opportunity to enact revenge and kill off the current king and work with the heir to the throne because he obviously wants to, you know, take the place of the current king. We also follow a character named Anton, who's kind of a con man. And in this world, there's actually a magic system that allows people to basically possess other bodies. And the only way you know that someone is sort of hitched a ride on a new body as their eye color changes, and Anton is very, very good at doing this. He's kind of a con man that takes over people's lives for like short periods of time before moving on. He enters the trials because he wants to win the purse to try to help save his childhood love, who's kind of been trapped in a coma. Our two main characters sort of cross paths at the beginning of these trials and form an unlikely alliance, and we sort of see things unfold from there. Here's the deal. I just love the combination of all of these plot elements. First and foremost, I enjoyed the gray morality of our main characters. They were truly gray, and this book is very, very grim. The trial setting is very violent. What's fascinating about it is that it doesn't take place in like an arena. It takes place over the course of the entire city with the actual populace getting involved. Like, it's a really dark and interesting concept that Chloe Gong has added to this book, and seeing our characters interact within it was really interesting, not only in their interactions with each other, but also their own internal motivations. On top of that, I found the magic system to be really interesting, and I really appreciated how in-depth she went into explaining how it worked and how it functioned. On top of that, I really enjoyed the setting of this book, this really dense city with the hints of technology. All of it together was just entertaining. Again, could the characters have been fleshed out a bit more to feel a bit more dynamic? Yeah. Could the plot have had a few more elements from a world building point of view? Sure. But honestly, I could not put this book down. I flew through it. I was very entertained, really entranced by this book. I read it in the course of a few days. I liked it, and I'm so happy I gave Chloe Gong another chance, and I would give this book like a 3.75 out of 5 stars. Next up, I couldn't let Michael J. Sullivan go. Once I finished the Legends of the First Empire series, I kept thinking about how I wanted to see those myths and stories that I read and loved so much over the course of those 6 books play out in the other well-known series that takes place like thousands of years in the future. So I picked up the first book to the Rhaenyra Revelation series, Sept of Swords, by the same author. This series technically came out way before the Legends of the First Empire, and I think the technical reading order is to read this first, then Legends, but I'm pretty sure you can kind of go in any direction personally. In the story, we're introduced to the very dynamic duo of Royce and Hadrian, and they're very, very notorious mercenaries. They're hired for various jobs, they're very good at these jobs, they're well paid for these jobs. You get the idea. At the beginning of the first book, they're basically hired to steal a sword from the castle for their client, but once they go and do it, they're basically framed in the murder of the king himself. From there, they're forced to leave on a quest with an unlikely companion to try to save the political situation of this kingdom, and the story begins to evolve from there. Again, this is actually a bind-up of 2 stories. The first is this sort of sword quest, as Royce and Hadrian are basically trying to clear their name and also save this kingdom from being overthrown. The second story is kind of a new quest of the week vibe, if you will, but definitely still connected to the political fallout of book 1. We see them basically take on this big, impossible beast that's terrorizing this city. I enjoyed this book. Honestly speaking, I would say this book is pretty stereotypical and straightforward from a fantasy point of view, but there was something about it that I found so comforting and homey that I still enjoyed it immensely. Like, the plot structure and setup of the first 2 installments of this bind-up were honestly like pretty predictable. I could kind of see where everything was going. Characters themselves, especially the side characters, I wouldn't say were very dynamic, almost like ideal NPC style characters you often run in fantasy stories. But at the same time, I was just like so chuffed by the entire experience. I still only have like positive vibes in regards to this bind-up. I will say, from a positive point of view, I did really enjoy Royce and Hadrian as a duo. They're funny. I enjoy how they interact with each other. I'm really curious to learn more about them and their very clearly murky past. I also feel like there is a lot of setup within these first 2 books to kind of show that there is a larger political scheme at play. Yes, these sort of quests or jobs that we follow our 2 main characters being hired onto, more so just like the starting place for the plot itself. Like, things do escalate and things are connected book over book, which I appreciate. But yeah, I wouldn't say this is mind-boggling. I wouldn't say this is nearly as good so far as the Legends of the First Empire, but I'm so just endeared to this style of story. It's just a structure and a writing style that I personally love so much, and I've loved my entire life. So I'd probably give this first bind-up like a 3.75 out of 5 stars. Not a 5-star read. Pretty straightforward, but at the same time, like, very homey. You know? The next book I read was one of my most anticipated releases of the year, and that was Silver Nitrate by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and was this book a ride? Oh my gosh. Definitely getting me in the mood for fall and to read some additional spooky reads, because this was a spooky good time. This book is set in the 90s in Mexico City, and we're following our 2 main characters, and we actually read from both of their point of views. The first character we follow is Montserrat, and she works as a sound editor both for film, TV shows, or just basically any work that she's able to get her hands on. She's incredibly talented, but the sound scene and kind of just the movie scene in general is very much a boys' club, and she struggles kind of getting consistent work, and also struggles with the office politics that are also constantly occurring. The other main character we follow is Tristan, a very handsome sort of movie star who's kind of more in a rut. In his 20s, he had some breakout moments, but since then, and after a tragic accident involving one of his previous girlfriends, he's kind of been more on the outskirts of like stardom, if that makes sense. He hasn't really had any big jobs for a long time. These 2 main characters are actually childhood friends. They grew up with one another. They were very close growing up, and they've maintained a very complicated relationship over the years. It's so interesting to see their dynamic, mostly because at times they're seemingly so annoyed with each other, but they also have a relationship where, like, if you call them up out of the blue, like needing to bury a body, if you will, they would definitely support each other in those endeavors. Like, their relationship is one that is like rock solid, will never crack through time, even if they have issues with the other person, which I just really loved how that relationship rooted the story. But what is this book about? So basically, these two characters are pulled in by this like once very popular director to finish and take a look at this cursed film that was made around like occultism, and this guy from Germany who's definitely tied to the Nazis created in like the 50s. From there, our two main characters are pulled into this dark world. Evil magic and this curse that was once attached to the film is seemingly impacting their lives in the present day. This book gets dark and spooky very, very quickly. We see our main characters, particularly Montserrat, as she falls kind of headfirst in her obsession with this dark magic and trying to figure out what is going on. There's a lot of history and film history at play here, a lot of terrible people doing a lot of terrible things that's still leaving like after effects many, many years later, even when they've been supposedly dealt with. This book balances like horror, occult, dark magic with really interesting and compelling characters so well. I loved how it very much centered the film scene. I loved the setting. I really enjoyed this book from beginning to end. It pulled me in. I felt like the pacing in the first third of the book was much slower, really giving us time to be introduced to our main characters, their motivations, who they are. And also each character's like unique brand of loneliness and how they sort of reach out or pull themselves inward because of it. There's so many different elements at play in this book. I feel like Silvia Moreno Garcia always has such interesting concepts to her story, but I found them to be very effectively done in this. I was entertained. I was horrified. I was nervous, I was scared. But there's also like an intermix of like comforting moments too, which I really think helped balance the sort of darker narrative. I really enjoyed this book. Another one I read really, really quickly, and I would give like a 4.25 out of 5 stars. And then the last two books I have not completed yet, but I still feel like are worth a shout out. The first is Fool's Quest by Robin Hobb. I read the first 50% of this book, which is like 400 pages, mind you. At the very beginning of this month, I read that 50% in a matter of days. I fell in head first in this book. The first book I was obsessed with, I gave 5 out of 5 stars to, and it also ended in a way that I needed to know what was going to happen next. And I, again, flew through the first half of this book. And then I pumped the brakes because I got really nervous about how fast I was reading this series, and I wanted to savor it. And I was too scared about finishing this book too quickly, and that is why I did not read any more of it, because I can assure you it has nothing to do with the quality of the story, because boy, did I love it. The quest that you're clearly anticipating going into the final trilogy of the Robin Hobb universe following The Fits and the Fool is definitely beginning to take place. It's so intense and like emotionally taxing reading the series that I feel both completely pulled in but also wanting to look away because I'm just like sobbing and crying while reading this. It's just a lot, you know? But the Robin Hobb universe is by far and away one of my favorites. The combination of magic and character arcs and storylines will absolutely live in your soul forever. Fitz in particular is one that will just like take your breath away, and the character arc that we're following Fitz in this final trilogy is amazing while also being very difficult to read. I loved this. I will be finishing this, I want to say, next month, but I did read half of it this month quickly. But I need to get back to it, but I didn't finish it this month, I will say. And lastly, I did also read 100 pages of The Spear That Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez, and this book is so unique. I feel like I'm savoring every single page of this book because I have read nothing like this in my entire life, and it is beautiful and also just like simply I feel like it'd be turning into like one of my favorite things. Again, I have a lot of this book left to experience, but just the structure and concept of this book is 10 out of 10. This book is like a layered story within a story within a story within a story. It's honestly like a little hard to describe. I think a big part of this book is just reading it and experiencing for yourself, or basically being told this myth. The myth of this once very evil kingdom that existed, ruled by an emperor who had access to very dark magic, and his sons also had access to this very dark magic. They're literally called the Terrors, and the reason why they had this ability is because they had a god imprisoned within their castle. At the beginning of the book, this god escapes though, and so begins like a series of events after this god is let out of the castle. But here's the deal, structurally how this book is told or written is like a myth. We have a sort of main character at the turn of the century, and he is being told this story by his grandmother. We're sitting down with him in his grandmother's kitchen as she rolls cigarettes and tells him this tale from the past. We're also being told this tale from this young man as he's presenting it to an audience at a much larger scale, and then we're also reading the tale as it kind of unfolds from the perspective of the characters who are a part of this like larger story. story. So again, it's like this layered storytelling experience, and it works beautifully. It really captures this feeling of myth, still very much having the emotional connection of not only the storytellers, but also the characters themselves within the myth. I am really enjoying it. Again, I've only read the first part of this book, but I just have a feeling this is truly just one of the most unique books I've picked up, and it's landing for me so far, and I'm gonna be slowly making my way through it, I feel like, over the next month or so. It is so good. Alrighty guys, those are all the books I read for the month of July. Please let me know down below some books you've read recently, as I would love to know. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye!